the chances that you're going to get scammed or there's going to be something misrepresented are much lower because you've listened to conversations like this.
These next 6 months may be the best time to go solar.
Is this the right company that I'm working with to install my system? Is it the right technology, which is where REC comes into play? And then does it meet the right economic objective? And it's just bad politics to sign a piece of legislation that closes businesses. And these are people's blood, sweat, and tears.
All right, welcome back to the Solar Surge podcast. Hey, if you're new to this channel, on this program, we meet with the top business leaders and thought leaders in the solar and energy storage space. And in today's episode, I'm joined by Brian Lynch, who's the Director of Policy and Strategy at REC. And we're going to be discussing all that's going on right now in terms of U.S. government policy as it relates to the solar industry. So, Brian, it's really good to see you again. Thanks for joining us today.
Joe, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having me. And I think there's a lot to talk about.
Yeah, obviously no shortage of things to talk about when it comes to solar policy. Of course, right now, everybody is sort of wondering, what is the final Senate version of this so-called big, beautiful bill going to look like? And what's that going to mean for solar subsidies and tax credits, particularly on the residential side of things? So, Brian, I guess just to open it up, can you please let the audience know at a high level what has been going on in Washington in terms of potential changes to solar policy, and what effect do you think that that's going to have on the industry as a whole?
Yeah, so that's the most important question. And I should note that we are recording this in late June, and it's very dynamic, right? So this might change if you're listening to it, in July or August or even later on if you catch an archive of it. Right now, the Senate has taken up what's called the One Big Beautiful Bill through what's commonly known as a reconciliation process. So reconciliation is a type of legislation that's preferred by both parties because it only requires a simple majority. And so because Republicans control, of course, the White House, but also the House and the Senate, they can use this vehicle, which is really a budget vehicle, to advance their policies without bringing in the other side. This is a legislative kind of trick that both parties use. Democrats use it when they pass the Inflation Reduction Act. So it's not really a Republican thing or a Democratic thing. It's simply a policy vehicle that's used. And in this policy vehicle, because solar relies on tax credits, they're able to modify those tax credits as part of a budgetary process. And so what just happened this week is the Senate Finance Committee has proposed their version of the language, which calls for the elimination of the consumer tax credit, also referred to as a 25D tax credit, effective 180 days after the bill is signed. So if it's signed July 4th weekend, which is what the president wants, then that's effectively the end of the year. If it drags on into later July, early August, then you would effectively accrue those days on the back end so the projects could be completed in early 2026. There's another side of the industry called third-party ownership. Those monetize tax credits against Section 48E of the tax code. And there's a very interesting piece of language in the proposed legislation that excludes the tax credit from being monetized in residential lease systems. And so this means that if you're thinking similar like EVs, where the consumers it was harder to get the consumer tax credit, but if you leased an EV, you could get the tax credit and then just buy the vehicle out from the lease. They've effectively attempted to close that loophole in residential solar. So this is a really big deal for anyone that's been thinking about going solar, and that 30% tax credit potentially makes or breaks your project.
Yeah, well, Brian, that's a little bit disconcerting because just at the surface level, it sounds like the big corporations get to keep their tax benefits. Individual consumers are going to lose their tax benefit for solar. Am I hearing that correctly?
Yes and no. So that lease exclusion does impact companies like Sunrun and LightReach and the other financiers. It did not call out power purchase agreements. So a power purchase agreement is a different way that solar companies structure deals. It's also third-party ownership, but it's not a lease. The simple way to think about it is if you live in an energy choice state or a state that's deregulated from energy, and you can choose who you buy power from, you can typically enter into a power purchase agreement. Not every state, that's not a hard and fast rule, but that's really where we see the dividing line fall on. So if you live in a state that doesn't have energy choice, that means you could only use third-party ownership for leases. Those would be disallowed under both the House and the Senate rules as they exist today, whereas a power purchase agreement would still theoretically be eligible for the tax credit. Well, there's an open question about whether or not they'll allow that in the final piece of legislation. So again, it's very dynamic. We don't really know. But to answer your question directly, Joe, yeah, if you're a homeowner who wants to own your own power, own your own system, and take advantage of the tax credit, that window is rapidly closing to be able to grab a hold of it.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, I guess if you are a homeowner considering installing a solar power system and you want to still be able to claim that tax credit, these next 6 months may be the best time to go solar that is for you, depending on what they come out with. Now, Brian, I was made aware just 2 days ago, I was made aware of an alternate proposal that came out that I believe had some support from some of President Trump's team in the White House, which was instead of to do away with the 25D credits this year, it would be to sort of gradually sunset them over the next 3.5 years. So at the end of the Trump term, basically they would have been phased out, but it would give the industry a little bit more time to adjust. Obviously would hopefully the industry can avoid having to do like massive layoffs and, just really rapid job losses and downsizing. Have you heard anything about that alternate proposal? And if so, what's your take on it?
Yeah. So I should point out that the Senate version of the bill allows for non-residential 48E claim systems to effectively have that glide path, which is what we're starting to call it as an industry, where if the project commences construction in 2025, the project would be allowed to monetize that full 30% tax credit. That's the rule that's been around for quite some time. Point out, it's been bipartisan historically. The next year, for projects that commence construction in 2026, the tax credit would be 60% of the 30%, which is 18%. I'll do the math for everybody. And then if the project starts construction in 2027, it would be 20% of the tax credit or 12% of that amount. So effectively, that is a glide path. It's not a great glide path, but it certainly improves upon the House version, and it will theoretically allow the industry to transition a little bit more sustainably to minimize job losses and lack of investment. What the residential side is asking for is, hey, why are you treating us different than utility side? Okay, they have more money, they have bigger lobbyists, but we're important too. We create a lot of jobs, we allow energy choice, all things that Republicans historically like. And so the ask for the residential industry is don't treat us differently from other segments. Let's look at solar as a universal application, a universal technology that benefits all ratepayers, whether or not they can actually directly go solar. If your neighbor goes solar, let's say you live in a house that is surrounded by trees, faces north. If your neighbor goes solar, that benefits you as a ratepayer who's buying power from utility because there's less maintenance and transmission distribution costs that they have to incur because your neighbor's buying less power.
Yep. No, that makes sense. That makes sense. I think a lot of people misunderstand that too, or at least I've heard a lot of feedback saying like, hey, I don't want to pay higher rates to subsidize your solar power system. And maybe there's some truth to that when you're talking about a true one-for-one net metering buyback program, where of course the utility is not going to be able to profit anything on a one-for-one net metering. They've got to have some way to mark it up and to profit from the distribution. But like you said, in theory, that distribution should be much shorter if you're able to take excess solar from your neighbor's house and consume that in your house, as opposed to having to pull from a power plant that's tens or hundreds of miles away.
Yeah, I mean, I think now you're getting into some interesting philosophical debates about the value of solar. Minnesota, many years ago, developed a model called the value of solar tariff, or the VSOT. Massachusetts has attempted to quantify this exact question of, does one person going solar negatively impact every other ratepayer because they're buying less, right? Because the other side of the argument that I mentioned is there's fixed costs for utilities. And if there's less people buying less power, then those fixed costs are displaced over more ratepayers. Utilities know this. California, that has high solar saturation, that's where you start to see like grid access charges. So if you're still connected to the grid, which most homeowners are after they go solar, then you pay a connection fee effectively. You're buying less, but you're still supporting to maintain that infrastructure, and that's a way to levelize it. Now, as a solar proponent, as someone who has solar in my house, I don't like access charges, but I respect that they're important. It's kind of like paying a road tax for a road you never drive on. Well, just because you don't drive on it your daily commute, well, maybe the truck that delivers your groceries needs to drive on it. Maybe the fire truck to get to your house needs to drive on it. So this idea of that we live in an interconnected ecosystem, and therefore we all need to pay our fair share, even if we're participating or buying less for things like going solar.
Makes sense. Well, Brian, let's talk specifically about REC, because one of the products that we've been covering very closely this year is the new Alpha Series solar modules, the Alpha Pure R and the Alpha Pure RX, which primarily are being deployed for residential rooftop applications. What do you see as potential impact on demand for the Alpha Pure R line if the bill were to pass based on the current configuration?
It's an interesting question. I spent a lot of my days and nights trying to answer that. There will always be demand for solar, right? The genie's out of the bottle. If we lose the tax credits on the residential side, there will likely be a pretty significant drop in demand from homeowners. And this is simply because if you didn't go solar when the tax credit was available, are you going to go solar next year when the tax credit is not available? Theoretically, right? If the legislation is signed into law. That is an interesting dynamic that, yes, there will be some base level demand. People move, they buy EVs, their utility raises their rates substantially, and the pain point is hit. And solar will still be economically viable in some markets, although, of course, with a not as sufficient payback. So we'll still see some base level demand. But that same technology that we manufacture in Singapore and soon in India is a very proven, high efficiency, high performing product. And we will transition the manufacturing of that product to support non-residential applications. So these utility scale projects that will still have access to tax credits will simply provide product for that segment. And so this is a good surety for homeowners that are maybe worried about the bankability of their manufacturer. Will still be in business. U.S. is still a very important market for REC, and we'll continue to support it. I do want to point out that in both the House and the Senate version of the language, there's very restrictive, what they've called FEOC prohibitions. FEOC is DC's acronym for Foreign Entity of Concern, which is really North Korea, Russia, Iran, and China. And from a solar industry perspective, there's no components coming from North Korea or Russia that I'm aware of. It's really Chinese suppliers. And China has dominated this industry for many years. Since 2008, when they did a 5-year plan and heads down said, hey, solar is really going to grow. We're going to really invest in it. A lot of the suppliers have Chinese ties, and they use Chinese components. There's Chinese investments in a lot of these companies. And under the rules proposed by the House and the Senate, the majority of those would lose access to the tax credit. And so this is something else that homeowners should be interested in following, because if they're thinking about going solar, they should really understand what's the provenance of that material. Even if it doesn't directly come from China, maybe it comes from a U.S. factory owned by a Chinese company. Maybe it comes from Southeast Asia owned by a Chinese company. In theory, that tax credit would not be allowed for those companies, which means they might pull out of the U.S. market. So even if they can get it today, is there going to be a company there to honor the warranty in 5-10 years? Heaven forbid something goes wrong with that system. So it's a big flag that I think most homeowners and consumers are not even considering as they're really thinking about going solar now and end of 2025.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the trends that we saw beginning to emerge was this, reshoring of the solar supply chain, and even foreign-owned companies wanting to open up or invest in building U.S.-based factories to produce products to serve the U.S. market. With the proposed changes to tax credits and subsidies, what effect do you think that's going to have on potential investment in U.S. Domestic solar manufacturing?
Joe, that's a good question. The business case to manufacture in the U.S. prior to the election was as strong as I've ever seen it. There was strong supply side incentives as well as demand side incentives, and which is why we've seen so much investment in the last 2 or 3 years. And this is actually something that today, as we engage with our elected officials in D.C., we're able to talk about the manufacturing jobs that have been created, because this is something that's broadly bipartisan. Everyone loves manufacturing jobs. Everyone loves economic investment. And the solar industry has created a lot of these jobs in the last couple of years. And so there's a lot of manufacturers that are now heavily engaged in DC saying, hey, you set these rules. We've engaged in this based on these rules. It's very harmful for us to rug pull, right? To just yoink the incentives away prematurely. And so I think the investments that are, in process, maybe they've just started operating, those companies will do everything they can to recover that investment and keep those factories going. The ones that were maybe earlier stage, maybe the large CapEx hasn't been committed, they're in a permitting process or whatever, those are 100% at risk. Not solar specific. Any industry requires certainty. And I think one of the biggest fallouts that we're not yet able to quantify on what's happening with this one big beautiful bill is if industries lose the certainty that there'll be a change every 4 years in administration and the incentives might change, even if you have a 10, 15-year horizon on what's legislated, if we're willing to just pull that away from industry, that's going to freeze investment, right? Again, solar's political, it's ideological elements, which in my mind are ridiculous, but they exist and I'll acknowledge they exist. Let's say you're Airbus, right? And you want to locate a new factory in the United States, and there's incentives that are created to create those jobs and encourage that investment. Would the CEO of Airbus or Siemens or whatever foreign entity want to make that investment in the U.S., understand that the risk that there's now potentially precedent that in 2, 3, 4 years, those investments might go away.
Yeah. Well, Brian, they call it the solar coaster. And for those of us who have been in the industry for a while, it's almost like we've gotten used to this kind of talk before, like, oh, the sky's falling. And then, we figure out a more graceful solution and the industry chugs along. But I can definitely understand what you're saying, though. I mean, without some kind of certainty that the policy is stable, or at least to be able to see a multi-year trajectory of where the policy is going, would make it very difficult to put out capital, for example, to build a manufacturing facility, not knowing what you might be able to sell your product for 2 or 3 years into the future to be able to recoup your investment. So, I think that's an issue of concern. Brian, also, as you know, there's just been a number of shakeup with solar financing and the structure of solar financing, and potentially some unethical things that have been going on as far as how these solar deals have been structured to homeowners. I know a lot of that is still playing out in the legal system right now, but do you have any thoughts on what do you think will emerge, or do you expect to see any change policy-wise on consumer protection or price controls or anything to kind of set some guardrails for how this can be structured for homeowners in the future?
Yeah, that's a good question. Ultimately, as part of the reconciliation process, the federal government cannot do consumer protection legislation. This is really a budgetary process. And so they can craft legislation that limits who can access the tax credit, the amount of tax credits that are available, but they can't really go beyond those boundaries just due to the rules that are applied to this process. With that said, I mean, you call out a big pain point of solar, and it's something that pains me as an industry advocate and industry professional for 2 decades. There are people that have seen this industry as, an opportunity to scam people, and that's what it is. It's a scam. Unfortunately, attorney generals have gotten involved. We've really chased out a lot of the bad actors, but as long as there's someone who's willing to operate outside of the lines of ethics and responsibility, you're going to have those players. And it's incumbent upon the local officials, the competitors of those companies, the attorney generals in those areas to weed those people out and move them on to something else. Now, I think there's a question. Does the tax credit enable that? In some ways it does, because it creates more margin and it creates something, a financial element in the project that homeowners simply don't understand. It amazes me the number of homeowners that don't understand how their taxes work. And a tax credit is not something that you get a check back from the federal government. It's simply a deduction of what you owe the government. And that's broadly misrepresented in the industry. It's broadly misstated. And consumers don't have an understanding of a relatively simplistic concept on how that impacts them. That's a problem. That's a challenge. Yes, we have to address it. But, the vast majority of solar salespeople, of solar businesses, are operating with ethics. They are representing this properly. And this is why, every manufacturer would encourage every homeowner to get multiple quotes, right? Don't just rely on one person who knocks on your door. Fact check them. Do research. Listen to Solar Surge. Watch these videos, right? This is all education. It's why REC loves working and partnering with folks like Joe and the Solar Surge team, because the chances that you're going to get scammed or there's going to be something misrepresented are much lower, because you've listened to conversations like this and you've learned to ask the questions and get multiple quotes. That's going to protect you. Do we need regulation to force that? I don't think regulation can. And I don't think from a GOP orthodoxy standpoint, regulation is the answer. It's going to come down to laws and ethics and people just doing the right and smart thing.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think part of it is just enforcing the laws that are currently on the books, but understanding how to apply that to a solar proposal. Because, like you said, Brian, a lot of these solar proposals, in order for the math to pencil out, you're assuming that everybody's going to get the full 30% tax credit. A lot of times the sales rep is not fully disclosing that, this tax credit is really based on your tax liability and whether you've already paid those taxes in, or you're just, getting your end of the year bill reduced by a certain amount. But I guess one thing, especially when you look at a product like REC and particularly the Alpha Series, is, it would be considered more of a premium option. And so if a homeowner is requesting your product by name, chances are they've done their research. They're not just buying generic solar, they're buying a specific solution that they're looking for, which is a good sign.
Yeah, Joe, and I like to add that REC is a premium product, which means that the way that the product flows into the market is handled through what we think is a better way. So we have what's called REC certified solar professionals. So these are contractors that we've vetted that we believe are offering the right level of service to properly represent our product. Now, anyone can buy an REC module. They can go to any warehouse and buy it. But if you're an RCSP, then that means that we've looked at and vetted this company as being a good company. Doesn't mean that 100% of those salespeople are going to operate 100% ethically. But again, it's just a layer of protection that we offer homeowners, that they're working with someone that we've vetted, that it's going to sell and build a system that we stand behind.
Right. Well, and touching on that as well. So you have a vetting process as far as who as an installer is allowed to offer the REC Pro Trust warranty, correct? And I know that's one of the big differentiators as well, as you're not just warrantying the physical aspects of the product or the electrical aspects of the product, but with the Pro Trust protection, you're also essentially guaranteeing the labor or the service that might be required to replace a defective product as well. Is there anything more that you can share with the audience of how REC vets its certified service partners or installation partners?
Yeah, can't go into the details. That's between us and those companies. Just know that we do monitor their performance, the reviews that they get online. So there's an element of crowdsourcing, again, because we are not in everyone's living room. We're not attending all these virtual appointments that are being done every day. We really look and aggregate feedback from the market of, is this company installing and representing the product in the right way? I break it down, Joe, into three questions that a homeowner should ask. Is this the right company that I'm working with to install my system? Is it the right technology, which is where REC comes into play? And then does it meet the right economic objective? And if those three questions can be answered with a yes, then I think the homeowner should have confidence to move forward with solar. And again, REC will wrap the technology in terms of industry-leading warranty, but also, as you pointed out, if that contractor goes away in 12 or 15 years, and this is a statistical insignificant probability, there's also a fault with the module, we will pay someone else to go out there and repair or replace that system on your roof. So again, this is another level of assurance that REC offers, because we care about the homeowners that have trusted in our products and made the investment in REC because they're investing in a premium solution.
Great. Now, Brian, another trend that I've observed in the industry over the past year or so is a number of residential contractors are starting to expand into or switch primarily to commercial installations, and particularly in markets like Texas, where the net metering programs are going away. And so there just seems to be a more compelling value proposition for solar for commercial entities. Now, I know REC has recently rolled out the new Alpha Pro M module, and we do have a video coming out about that module very soon. Can you tell us a little bit about, has REC strategy changed as far as whether you're targeting residential or commercial, or what the balance between those two should be?
Yeah, today, as of the time of recording this, the majority of our product ends up on homeowners' rooftops. High efficiency, really great for space constrained applications, great in high heat applications, really well suited for homeowners' rooftops, asphalt shingle rooftops. With that said, based on policy changes, maybe the residential segment shrinks and the non-resi segment grows, again, because there's a proposal in the Senate to keep those tax credits at a higher level and phase them out over time. And so we can adjust the products we make in the factory to support those segments. And again, why is this important to someone listening to this? Well, it should give you assurance that we'll still be in the market, we'll still be able to honor warranty claims, and we still have a viable path going forward for the company, even in light of whatever DC ends up signing into law here in the next month or two.
Makes sense. Makes sense. And that's something that we're probably going to begin covering more and more on this channel as well, as more of, the commercial equipment and commercial business practices and financing options and things, where I know a lot of our focus in the past has been on residential only. But it seems that if you're looking at, where does solar make the most investment sense, it is going to be in the non-residential sectors in the near future, if things pass the way that they're currently written. But Brian, I know that you're going around a lot, speaking at conferences, meeting with folks. What are you advocating for as far as what changes would you like to see in this current legislation? Are you still advocating for changes and amendments to this, or are you just preparing for what's already on the table to be written into law?
Yeah, until the bill is signed into law by the president, it's not done, and there's still an opportunity to change. So I think we've tempered expectations on what solar can get in this current cycle. We acknowledge that the policy will change, probably needs to change. And so what REC has really staked its positioning on is we would like every solar panel, every solar system to be treated equally. So whether it's claimed under 25D or 48E, whether it's a residential lease or utility farm in the middle of the desert, there should be no difference in the application of the tax credit. And so if there's a multi-year phase out for utility scale solar farms, then homeowners should also be able to access those multi-year tax credits and that phase out. So we're asking for parity. I think it's a very fair ask. It's something that supports jobs, it supports Main Street solar and small businesses. And we're getting some resonance and traction in DC with this ask because people understand that DC really shouldn't be picking winners and losers in this fight. And ultimately, the contractor that's on the rooftops is a local business. They're your friends, they're your neighbors. They operate in all 50 states in almost every congressional district. And so if someone signs their name to a piece of legislation that puts 30, 40, 50 people out of business per company in their constituency, well, that adds up. And it's just bad politics to sign a piece of legislation that closes businesses. And these are people's blood, sweat, and tears, right? These small business owners have invested 10, 15, 20 years of their life to build this business are now at risk of going away if the incentives are just rug pulled out from under them. That is unfair. The other thing that's very interesting, Joe, that's just happened this week is some pretty vocal oil and gas proponents have gone into DC and told the GOP, hey, go easy on those solar guys. Yes, they're big. Yes, they're a competitor, but they've sensed that they don't know the outcome of the next election like nobody does. And if the Democrats were to control both the House and the Senate and the White House, there's a very high probability that there's this tit for tat. And the Democrats then rug pull out the oil and gas incentives. And that's just bad, right? We talked about this. Businesses need certainty. Energy is not a winner take all situation. It's everyone needs a fair share of the pie because solar generates electricity in a different way at different times at different values than baseload generation does. And so we need an all of the above strategy. And when things become political and ideological, you don't get what's best for the country. And so this is a very interesting development that just happened this week. Will it make a difference? Well, it certainly doesn't hurt, but it's good to see that some folks that maybe were not historically advocates for solar are tempering their voices to say, no, this is actually about business. This is about economic certainty. This is about fairness and equity, which is a great update to this whole conversation.
Yes. Yeah. I certainly hope that cooler heads will prevail because like you said, if this gets into a tit for tat thing and you've got, hundreds of thousands of jobs of industry people that are being toyed around with because of whatever the political, season is, or whatever the political flavor of the day is, that really does not help create a robust renewable energy industry. And so if we want a robust renewable energy industry, as we have a robust fossil fuel energy industry, we've got to have some sort of certainty so that all of the market participants, from your local contractor all the way up to equipment manufacturers can invest with some sort of certainty, right? Which means we have to understand what the trajectory is that we're on so we know where we're going to be 2, 3, 4 years from now and can make decisions accordingly.
So there's effectively two things that are bipartisan in 2025. One is jobs are good, right? Everyone agrees jobs are good. And two, China and our reliance on China is not as good. And in both the House and the Senate versions of the One Big Beautiful Bill, they've gone through great pains to restrict access to the tax credits for Chinese companies or these fiat companies. The interesting thing is if you remove the incentives, then you remove the fiat prohibitions by default. Because if the fiat restriction is, well, you don't get the tax credit, but there's no tax credit to monetize, Well, what the industry will understandably do is just move to the lowest cost components. As they look to close the gap between the pre-tax credit base and the post-tax credit base, they're going to do that by sourcing subsidized product from overseas. And if there's no prohibition on getting the tax credit, then that's understandable why people would do that. Now, China entered this race in 2008 with the goal of monopolizing it, and they're pretty close to it. The US is really the last country that's put any sort of meaningful blocker on it. But if we get rid of the tax credits and therefore the de facto fiat prohibitions, that hands the industry to the Chinese. And this is another talking point that's playing really well, especially in locations where people have made investments, were disproportionately red states and GOP-controlled states. You're going to put this factory out of business the next 2, 3, 4 years, and it's going to be replaced by imports from China. Do you want to sign your name to that legislation? And that's where, ideology aside, no, they don't. And so, again, we're creating these kind of wedge issues and showing that the size and strength of solar vertically integrated from the manufacturers in Georgia, North Carolina, and Texas to the rooftops, wherever you're listening to this, is an interconnected supply chain that over time will graduate from the need for subsidies. But until we acknowledge that China is heads down committed to controlling this, we need to support an industry in the way that they support their industry.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. You know, I've always said, Brian, that solar is really a nonpartisan issue. I mean, there's different narratives that get attached to the solar industry as far as why it's important, why it's necessary. But the reality is solar is good for the entire nation, right? I mean, we have technology now. It's affordable. We're basically, households can be energy independent, energy neutral at the household level. And yes, we do need other forms of generation, but you know, the less reliant we are on foreign sources of energy, foreign sources of electrical components and all these kind of things, that has got to be good for America overall. But I think part of it is, you know, sometimes solar gets attached to this sort of Green New Deal agenda, where really I think if you just look at solar as a technology on its own, it just makes sense regardless of how you align politically. And I hope folks will see it that way, that it's, you know, a good, robust solar industry is good for America.
That's right. I have a lot of friends that work in solar that voted for the Trump administration and voted Republican. That's great. I'm an independent, right? I'll say that. I don't think either party represents my interests. There's a lot of homeowners that are unabashedly far right that go solar because they want self-reliance. They want energy choice. They want energy dominance. These are all Republican talking points. They want to support Main Street businesses. And so when you think about the industry through the lens of a non-ideological standpoint, you're right. It is nonpartisan. It is broadly supported by registered Republicans as it is Democrats. And unfortunately, in DC, you lose that nuance. You lose the reality of what's happening in every community across America. And it goes back to, well, they donated to them, and actually more importantly, there's a prevalent thought in DC that tax credits that support solar just go right to Beijing. And I think before the IRA was passed, there was an element of truth to that. Chinese entities controlled this sector. That has changed substantially in the last couple of years because of the IRA. When we talk about the tax credit by itself, that has been bipartisan. It's existed for decades. I've been in solar since mid-2000s, and we've always had the tax credit. We've almost lost it a couple of times. It's been a 1 year at a time kind of see if we can get it renewed. But at the end of the day, the Bush administration, the Obama administration, the first Trump administration, Trump extended the tax credit at the end of 2020. And so it has historically been bipartisan. It's not until now they've controlled the House and the Senate that's really come up in terms of needing to get rid of these tax credits. And I think most people in the solar industry understand that we do need to phase out these tax credits, but it's a phase out, and again, not a rug pull. The rug pull would be disastrous.
Yep, I agree 100%. We need a graceful phase out. If we know where we're going several years in the future, we can plan properly and we can get there. Correct. But I can't imagine, I mean, just putting my political lens on here, I can't imagine that Republicans want massive layoffs and job losses, particularly in the skilled construction trades, which are going to be most affected by this, right? These are, my understanding, a block of voters that are, you know, could be swung either way. Tend to had swung to Trump in the last election, and I think Republicans would want to keep those voters. So again, I think a graceful phase out as opposed to a rug pull is absolutely the right solution, Brian. But I know we're getting close to the end of the interview here. Is there anything else that the audience should know about? Again, if you're if you're out there watching this, if you're in the solar industry, if you're a contractor, electrician, maybe a salesperson, distributor, Brian, what do you want these people to take away from today's episode?
Yeah, if you're listening to this and the bill has not yet signed into law, get involved. Reach out to your elected official. You can go to save25d.org or savemainstreetsolar.org. They both actually go to the same place. There's a form on there that is pre-written. You can just put in your address. It calls out who your elected officials are, and it sends a note to those offices. Now, don't think that your congressperson, your senator is going to read those, but a staffer might, an intern, maybe it's AI at this point, and they're going to tally, and they're going to say, oh, we had a voter in our constituency who says this is an important issue for them. So please take that small step. It takes 20 seconds to do. You can edit the language in the letter that's pre-filled out for you. So if you don't like it, you can modify it. I would encourage you, if you're listening to this before the July 4th recess, and if your elected officials are having a campaign event in your community, attend. Politely and professionally say these tax credits are important to you. Again, whether you're a homeowner who's already gone solar, you're thinking about going solar, maybe you have a student in college who wants to work in the solar industry in a couple of years, you want those jobs, you want this infrastructure to be there to support that. Again, even if you don't work in solar, if you're listening to this, you're interested in it, which means you should get involved. If you have a connection to the elected official directly, of course, reach out. You can write an op-ed for your local paper. Again, not a lot of people read those, but the staffers in the offices do. We have to make the 300,000 people that work in the solar industry in the U.S., we have to make those voices heard, and we have to multiply them. And so if you're a friend, an advocate, a customer, anything, if you're listening to this, get involved because your voice 100% matters. After this bill leaves the Senate, it has to go back to the House as part of the reconciliation process. The House is what really put in some draconian language. And so the Freedom Caucus and the House will have another chance at chipping away any gains that we make in the Senate. And so we can't ignore we can't ignore that the bill will go back to the House. So please reach out to them. They're just as important. And ultimately, the president has to sign it too. And this is where highlighting the jobs, the energy dominance, and all the things that the president ran on that solar supports, these are things that we should be highlighting as being important for the administration and their strategic objectives.
Excellent, Brian. Appreciate your great, clear call to action there. Folks, again, this has been a discussion with Brian Lynch. He's the Director of Policy and Strategy at REC, of course, one of the top solar panel manufacturers in the world. Brian, I really thank you for taking time to chat with our audience today, and I look forward to doing a future interview with you.
Joe, I appreciate it. Thanks for running this interview. I think it is important, and hopefully next year we'll get to shoot ice balls at REC panels or do something a little bit more fun than talk about job losses and economic harm. Thanks for your time.
Yeah. Hopefully we can bash a few panels in celebration of a new tax credit. We'll see how it all shakes out.
The flamethrower is a lot of fun.
Okay, that's the first I've heard of that actually. Okay, we'll have to get on the list here before the end of the year. All right, Brian. Well, thanks again for your time, and look forward to catching up with you again in the future.
Appreciate it, Joe. Thanks.
All right.